I'm so pleased and appreciate this opportunity to talk to you about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, has been for a long time, since my mother and my dad too became so interested in this subject way back when. So I will begin to talk, and I'm going to do this from the point of view is there reason for reasonable people to have reasonable doubt about who wrote Shakespeare? There is a declaration on the internet called the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, and it has more information along the lines of what I'm going to be telling you today. So if you have some interest and you want to, it comes right up on the internet. Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, just click on it and you can find more information. The Declaration has, now I don't know why it's doing this, but at any rate, we have three patrons of the Declaration that are very famous and well-known Shakespearean actors. Up on the upper left, you can see Sir Derek Jacobi, that many of us of our age remember well from his role in as Claudius in I, Claudius on public broadcasting, Masterpiece Theater. In the middle is Mark Rylance, and that's from his role as Thomas Cromwell in Wolf Hall. And in the lower right is Michael York, who lives in California and has been a very prominent and well-spoken person for our subject for many years. And he's come to our conferences from time to time. Very wonderful gentleman and a very fine scholar. And these are the patrons of the Declaration. So it is not something that is just put up very quickly. A lot of thought has gone into it. It has been written up in articles in the walls very favorably, in articles in the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek magazine, and it now has over 4,500 signatories. And we would hope that at some point, some of the more signatures might be yours. The notable people who have signed the Declaration, among them are two justices of the United States Supreme Court. And I don't think that either of these justices need any introduction. Along with the famous actors and the justices of the Supreme Court, many very well-known people from literary backgrounds have spoken about this subject over the years. And I'm not sure if how my pointer is going to work. Many of you may recognize Walt Whitman, Sigmund Freud. Another famous actor, Sir John Gielgud, was our very eloquent spokesperson for many years until his death. William F. Buckley Jr. did an episode of Firing Line on this subject. Ralph Waldo Emerson summed up the problem like this. He said the life, meaning the life of the man from Stratford, and the works that he supposedly wrote simply do not marry. And that's a quote that comes around a lot. Mark Twain, who of course is a nom de plume for Samuel Clemens, summed it up like this: Shakespeare is a brontosaur, 9 bones and 600 barrels of plaster. Now, one of the things that all of these people talk about when they're asked, well, why do you think Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare? Well, they come up and talk about with the knowledge that appears in these plays. Whoever Shakespeare was, he didn't just have a passing interest in these subjects. He had a command and a solid and deep understanding of some of these subjects that are up here on this slide. He knew a lot about the law. He knew about philosophy. He knew about medicine. There are over 700 to 800 medical references in the Shakespeare canon. He knew a lot about music. There are books and books about music in Shakespeare. He knew art, he knew mathematics, falconry, navigation, horticulture, military terms and tactics. He knew a lot about European geography, especially Italy. He knew foreign languages. He knew Italian, French, Latin, and Greek. And we know this because he utilized, whoever he was, he utilized over 300 sources. Many were untranslated from these languages, from Italian, French, and Latin and Greek. He knew about court life in England, in Italy, and France. This was a veritable encyclopedia of Renaissance knowledge that shows up in these plays. So, how did the Stratford man gain this knowledge? That is the question. What we have in writing, in the Stratford man's writing, all that posterity has are these 6 signatures. This is it. Now, when I'm face to face with an audience, and I've given version of this talk to lots of groups, library groups and civic clubs, and I ask people if they've ever seen these 6 signatures before. And usually no hands go up in my audience. No one but us has seen these 6 signatures before. This is it. This is all of these scrawls. They don't look really good just at first blush. No two are alike. Not one is actually Shakespeare, as the name appears on the title page. Are we sure they're his? That is a question that people ask all the time. And the answer to that question is yes. And we know that because these are all on legal documents. These are on documents that we know he signed. He needed to sign. One is a deposition to say, yes, this is my deposition. Two are on purchase of property, where he says, yes, this is the property that I purchased. And three, the bottom three, are on his last will and testament, which means, yes, this is my last will and testament. They are to authenticate these documents that are definitely his. Now, some of you may know who this fine-looking chap is. It's Professor Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard University. And once again, I'd ask for a show of hands if he's familiar to you. You may remember or recall his book, Will in the World, that was published in 2005. It was on many recommended book club lists. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. It made quite a hit at the time. It is his idea of how Shakespeare became Shakespeare and how he deals with these issues and how the works marry, or he would like to suppose that they did, how the works were, how the life marries with the work. And he writes this interesting comment on page 18. The great Professor Greenblatt has this to say: as it happens, more is known about him, he means Shakespeare, than about most of the professional writers of the time. Now, we hear this comment a lot in different ways and have for a long time. And one of our group, a woman named Diana Price, decided to check it out to see, okay, what do we know about Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford? And what do we know about the other writers of the time? And who are we talking about here? Just what are we looking at? And what she did, she made a survey of historical information about the other writers of the time. And you can order her book through Amazon, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography. And she categorized the type of information that a historical person we might be able to find about a historical person, and the information that would show that they did what history credits them with doing. There are 10 categories on this that she looks at. And let me see if is for an educated person, a person's a writer, they are by definition an educated person. So is there a record of education? Is there a record of, oh goodness, okay, that's what I thought would happen here. Okay, is there a record of correspondence? Do we have letters that this person wrote? If a person is a professional writer, or are they paid to write? Would he have a patron? Back then, artists and writers and literary people had patrons. Do we have any manuscripts? Do we have any other literary materials? What about tributes to this person or from this person? What about miscellaneous records? Did this person own books and notice of death as a writer? Now, what she did is she set out a chart. And this chart takes up 4 pages in her book. Across the top, very much across the top, are the leading professional writers of the time. She did a really great job of finding and locating the leading playwrights and a few other additional professional writers of the Elizabethan and early Jacobean time. Going down the left are these 10 categories, and I have them on 2 times these 10 categories, because as I said, I condensed 4 pages in her book. Now, if you look at the upper left, and I don't know if my marker is going to work, this person, Ben Jonson, we have evidence surviving for 10 of these 10 categories. This person, if he were a baseball player, he's batting 1,000. We have one writer of the time where we have 9 out of 10. He's batting 900. We have a couple of people batting 800. We have quite a number of writers of the time who are 700s. Now we get down to some 600s. We have a few 600s. We get to some 500s. 2 are 400s. One writer is 300. And this is William Shakespeare. There's nothing in any of these 10 categories, no hard evidence to support that he had an education, or that he wrote letters, or that he was paid to write, or that he owned books, or that he had notices of any sort of miscellaneous materials. This is very, very comprehensive. It's also very shocking when people look at this. And I give this talk a lot, as I say, and I can't see everybody's faces here. But when I give this talk to the civic groups and literary clubs, I look over my audience for a few seconds and people are stunned. It's just hard for them to get their head around this. They don't believe it. They kind of disbelieve, or it's just tough to understand that this is the case. It's especially tough to understand it in light of a few things I'm going to point out right now. First of all, the magnitude of what we know to be the Shakespeare canon. Whoever this person on the lower right is, and it's hard to see because of the because of the pictures of us that we have on the lower right, but this individual wrote more than just about everybody else on this list. In fact, this person right here, Thomas Kidd, is on this list for writing one play. It's considered to be a pretty good play, not as good as a Shakespeare play, but he's on this list as a professional writer for writing one play. Now, another thing to consider is that when you look at these other writers of the time, no one has ever tried to find out much about them and their history and what they did and what their life was all about. Only a handful of these writers have even a biography written about them all these years later. This phenomenon has been written about by none other. This is one of the leading English historians of the 20th century, and he wrote an essay on this subject, how hard people have studied and tried to find out things about William Shakespeare. And he wrote, this individual has been subjected to the most intense investigation. And this individual is Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford, remember. The most intense investigation ever directed toward a single historical person. And what they've come up with is nothing. Another thing to take into consideration is that Mr. Shakespeare, that's how his name is spelled for the most part, Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford, and people don't acknowledge this, he was a rich man. That below my gold notes there, he was living in the largest house in Stratford upon Avon. It even had a name. It was called the New Place. In fact, he owned 5 houses. Mr. Stratford owned 5 houses. His primary residence was the largest, of course, of all the houses. It had orchards, barns, gardens, stables, a courtyard in front. It had 10 chimneys, which is an indication that it had between 20 and 30 rooms. It was a mansion. By contrast, Mr. Ben Jonson, of whom we have so much material, the final value of his estate was £8, 8 shillings, and 10 pence. He died a very poor man, and he had no family. Mr. Shakespeare had 2 daughters who survived, a granddaughter who survived him. He lived, as it has been pointed out by other people, he was living in circumstances that would have been just fine to have preserved things about him, his letters, his documents, whatever. But yet we don't have anything from Mr. Shakespeare. Now, since I've talked about what we don't have, let's take a look at what we do have. Remember that last will and testament that I showed you those 3 signatures are from? Since I've spent a long time studying this last will and testament, we're going to take a look at it now. Here is Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford's last will and testament. It's a very long document. Most Elizabethan wills of people of his status in life were about a paragraph. A paragraph or 2 would do the job. But yet his will is rather long and involved. Lots of details. Now let's take a little closer look at it. Oh, before I do that, a note about Elizabethan wills. Wills were expected to be dictated by the person making the will maker. So these words that are in this will should be Mr. Shakespeare's own words. Even Orthodox scholars, even Professor Greenblatt agrees that Mr. Shakespeare, and sometimes they call him Mr. Stratford to be sure we're focusing on the right person, that Mr. Shakespeare Stratford dictated this will to an unknown scribe. This is not his handwriting. This will has been dictated. It's signed in 3 places, and I hope my cursor works without changing the slide on me. It's signed here. With the close-up that you can see of the will, it's signed down here. But the second page is right down there, and the third page is signed right here. It doesn't all show up anymore, thanks to the time losing parts of the page. But yes, this is Mr. Shakespeare's signatures. Now, let's take a little closer look at it. Orthodox scholars, we call them the Orthodox because we are, of course, the unorthodox, they have described this will quite openly as very sloppy and slovenly. And they lament this situation, that this is what the will looks like. It has many, many canceled passages. Well, this is a long canceled passage. It's got lots of words that have been scratched out, that have been canceled, as we say. It has a lot of interlineations. You can see in between the lines. A real close study of what's in between the lines is actually extremely important, and looking at the cancel passages, but I'm not going to do that right now. But generally, this will is regarded by the Orthodox experts as something of a mess. Now, I thought, and this was about 12 years ago, that because this will is so messy and it just doesn't sound very good if you really read it through, and there's a transcript of it in my book. It's hard to find a really good transcript of this will that's accurate, because actually one of the problems with this will is it's 3 pages of a run-on sentence. There's not a lick of periods or commas or anything in this will. And that's sort of shocking, because Shakespeare, the great writer, was very keen on punctuation. But that's just one of the issues of this will. I thought we needed to look more at this will, to look at it more closely. And in order to do that, the burden is always on us to say and find out, what did everybody else do? So I went to Rice University's Fondren Library here in Houston, where I'm a friend of Fondren, so I can go there and check out books. I checked out collections of wills, which is where you have to go to find wills. You have to go to collections that a historical society in England hired a historian to do transcriptions of a lot of wills so you can read them in our modern English. So I checked out lots and lots of books. In fact, I checked out everything I could get my hands on. And by the time I was finished with it, I'd accomplished 2 things. I had driven my husband crazy, and I'd read through about 3,000 early English wills. I'm not going to go through my will talk for what's in the will and what's not in the will. It should be, we'd like to think would be, takes about an hour. So obviously I'm not going to go through that. But just to say briefly, the view from 3,000 feet is, there are no books in the will. There's no mention of books. There's no mention of maps. And that's something you find in a lot of other wills. And a lot of educated people had books, and they will books in their wills. There's no mention of art. But what stunned me the most and surprised me the most is how many people made bequests for education. They had figured out all those hundreds of years ago that a better education meant a better life for their family. And all over the place, people who were very probably illiterate themselves or very poorly educated left money. They left money for family members. They would leave money for a nephew. So long as he shall stay in school, he shall get this money. They left money to the grammar schools, and they left money for scholarships for intelligent, needy students to get to go to Cambridge or to Oxford. They left money to their local grammar schools and to the headmasters. And one person wrote, so that poor men's children can learn to read and write. And there is nothing like this in Mr. Shakespeare's will. To me, that is the most shocking deficiency of all. He did manage to leave his wife his second best bed. What a guy. So if I have convinced you a little bit that there's some room for some doubt about this person, you'll say, okay, for the purposes of this talk, Bonner, and because we're a very polite audience, we will just go with it. We'll roll with it for the time being. If he didn't do it, the next question is, okay, who dat? And since they like to say that in New Orleans, who dat? Who done it? So now I'm going to spend the rest of my talk going into some things to tell you about the person that is my guy and my candidate, and why I believe the case is there to support him as Shakespeare. Now, let's start with a look. To answer this question, people ask me often, and my husband asked me that, how did we get from someone who could scarcely write his name from point A to this person being given all this credit and reverence and adulation for the centuries and made into a big national hero and revered as a big national hero? How did we get from point A to point B? Now, I'm going to try to give you an answer to that question. I think I can answer it, kind of, sort of, hopefully. Keep in mind that this individual who gets this credit died in 1616. Now, I know dates are kind of painful to cope with, but this date you need to keep in mind. Then, in 1741, a A statue to his memory was put in the hallowed halls of Westminster Abbey. Yes. Now, I've done the math a lot, so it's easy for me, but a century and a quarter went by from the time this man from Stratford died and the time of the statue to commemorate his memory in Westminster Abbey. A century and a half. The question is, why did it take so long? I think that's a pretty good question. And I suggest an answer to it. It took so long because living memory had to die out. Everyone who knew the man or knew someone who knew the man had to just be a thing of the past, and it was time to create something new. Living memory generally is considered to take 80 to 100 years to die out. And so we have living memory. Nobody at this point, when the statue's there, had any clear recollection, or if anyone who did have any real recollection of what this man from Stratford was all about. So it was not until the 1700s that a concerted effort, a real absolutely concerted effort was made to convince the English people that this individual represented in this statue was their great national hero. I offer to you, and actually there is a very famous Stratfordian scholar who agrees with this. This is not just me as an Oxfordian, which I'll explain to you in just a minute what that is. The placing of this statue was a crucial component to the process to elevate the Stratford man to the exalted position of a national hero and to get people to buy off on it. Now, we're talking the 18th century, the 1700s, and of course, no one had seen Diana Price's chart. That would be quite a few centuries in the future. Nobody knew that there were no books, that this person owned no books, that he had no letters, there were no manuscripts, no record of his education, no notice of his death, no note as a writer. Nobody knew this. They were just happy, and it was perfectly understandable. There was enough for people to have this beautiful statue in Westminster Abbey to admire, and the bard did become revered as a national hero, in spite of the fact that there was no evidence whatsoever to support this story. After 1741 and getting into the 1750s, within that decade, a tourist industry, and this phenomenon took place, a tourist industry began to grow in Stratford-upon-Avon. And the industry quickly became a really big business. Today, the Shakespeare industry, as we all know, and nobody's surprised, it's a multi-billion dollar or multi-billion pound, however you want to look at it. It is a big business in England and supporting this story and narrative. But getting back to the 1700s, and now we're to the 1800s, another century goes by, and people really thought, you can read what the great Edmund Malone, the father of modern Shakespeare study, he said, please go to archives, go to places where people have letters and things from the time, you'll find evidence. But a century had gone by, now we're to the 1800s, the 19th century, and it really became evident that nothing was going to turn up. Nothing had turned up. And so finally people began to ask questions. They had asked questions earlier, things didn't seem to quite fit, but questioning was more sub rosa. We're now to the point where people started to wonder out loud if Shakespeare was someone else. In fact, a number of candidates were proposed, and among them was Sir Francis Bacon. We know about the Baconians. His heyday was basically at the last half of the Victorian century, in the late 1800s and maybe into the early part of the 1900s. Now we move to the early 20th century. And we have this lovely, nice-looking gentleman. Doesn't he look like just a really nice gentleman from the earlier part of the 20th century? Yes, he does. He wrote a book where he decided that he would search for Shakespeare. And I'm running a little late on time, and I have a lot more to tell you, so I'm not going to read this to you, but he regarded it as a duty. And English people are very dutiful, then and now too, that it was a duty to honor the just claims that mankind owed this most illustrious of men. That was his reason, that he wanted to research this. The man's name was John Thomas Loney, and by vocation, he was a school teacher and a headmaster at a school in Gateshead on Tyne. I offer to you that this discovery made by this unassuming man is the most important event in literary history. The school teacher, Mr. Loney, decided that the Bacon theory and others that were floating around at the time did not really fit the works. Bacon was interesting because he was a commanding genius of the Elizabethan and Jacobean time, but he didn't really fit. What Mr. Loney objected to were there were these and several other theories, and he called them pick and try methods, where you find a historical person, find out a few facts about their life, and around these facts, you construct a scenario how that person came to be Shakespeare. And that was being done, and still is. But what Mr. Loney did is he set out to search systematically for Shakespeare. He took the position, he had no idea who Shakespeare really was, but he had to be someone that was not the Stratford man. That was his thinking. And in order to search for Shakespeare, he developed a profile. A profile. Profiles are pretty common today. You're looking for somebody, law enforcement is looking for a missing person, a criminal. They construct a profile of the crime. They learn about that person's life and they construct a profile around that. What's so amazing, it's so sensible and so reasonable to construct a profile when you have this fabulous work to pull from, have all this stuff this person knew about. It was such a reasonable thing to do that it is surprising that it had never been done before and it would never be done again. This is it. A Shakespearean profile was going to be used. Now, Mr. Loney published his book in 1920. The name of the book is Shakespeare Identified, and in it is an 18 characteristic profile that he developed. This is a lot of characteristics. And if you read the book, and it tells you all about his search through the literary people that he could find to look for, and how he did his search methods and how he used his profile. Here are the characteristics, and there are these 18 characteristics, and I'm not going to walk you through them now because there are a lot of them. If you want to read the book, published in 1920, it has just been republished in a 2020 centennial edition, and it is just wonderful. It's available on Amazon, and I highly recommend it because it's really a fun read. It's a detective story. It's literary, historical sleuthing that was done 100 years ago, and the new editor, a friend of mine, Jim Warren, has done a wonderful job of adding some interesting material to it that we now know, that Mr. Loney didn't know. Now, I want to point out just one thing about this profile, 18 characteristics. So far as I know, no Stratfordian, no one supporting the Stratford man, has ever stated that these 18 characteristics are wrong. Then they can look at him and say, yeah, he's a recognized genius. Look at your upper left. Yeah, would have had no literary taste. Sure, he would have been a lyric poet. Sure. They really don't complain about these 18 characteristics. And sometimes they even raid our profile. If you look at the lower left of the right side, probably Catholic. That's been a big deal in Shakespeare studies in the recent decades. The Catholic bard has been something that the Orthodox have been kind of working on. However, Mr. Loney expected it to be difficult to find someone who fit all 18 characteristics. And he thought that if he found someone that looked like a good candidate and fulfilled the majority of them, he'd have a pretty good fit. But surprisingly, he did find someone who fit all 18 characteristics. He found this man whose name is Edward de Vere, and he is the 70th Earl of Oxford. Now, right now, for those of you who are new to this, I want to make something that is very confusing to a lot of people. Noble people usually have two names that they're called by. Historians sometimes call them by their family name, which his is de Vere, or they're called by their title, and he's the Earl of Oxford. So he's often called and usually called Oxford, and I'm going to call him Oxford. Those of us who believe that the case supports that he is Shakespeare, we're called Oxfordians. So I am an Oxfordian. My mother was a pioneer Oxfordian. And so we are Oxfordians who support the candidacy of the Earl of Oxford. Now, two things make our guy a really, really good candidate. First of all, as I've already told you, he fit the profile. and finding some, if the profile's correct, and I think nobody really thinks that it is not correct, then it's amazing to find someone who fits. The second thing that is going to amaze those of you who aren't into this, who are just curious, and I appreciate amazingly, I can't begin to tell you how much I deeply appreciate that you're here listening to this. This should amaze you. The quantity of study and research that Oxfordians have done on our guy is just astonishing. It's not just a few little things here and there once in a while. Once this man was unearthed and extracted from the dustbin of history, where he resided for 300 years before he was extracted by the English school teacher. Now, in the 100 years since then, a ton of work has been done to learn about this man's life and to dredge into archives and to learn. And this is an index. It's not, these aren't articles. This is just an index of all of the study that's been done in these last 100 years on this man and his life and his work and everything about him. To give you an idea how intense it is, this is one person who's done a lot of work on it. Richard Whalen is a retired IBM executive. And after he retired, he spent a lot of effort researching. He became an Oxfordian, became interested, spent a lot of effort and time, and he has 5 pages of entries. And even as you can see here, even the writing is very small. 5 pages of entries for Richard Whalen for what he's done. And usually when I'm looking at something, one of the first people I turn to is to say, well, what does Richard Whalen have to say about that? And I can go to this index and I can find out. By contrast, I have in this book, which was published in 2017, in this index, almost a page of entries. And now, because it's from 2017, I'm sure I have over a page by this point, because I publish stuff all the time. But yeah, isn't that amazing? All of these people, you would find people with enormous resumes that would just impress you very, very much, that have spent their time and effort. And let me tell you, it's just a labor of love. No one that I know has ever made one dime, one red cent out of spending hours and incredible quantities of their money to go to libraries and study in all sorts of places and order books and documents. No one has ever made anything out of this study. They do it for love and because they become fascinated with it. You get into it and it's, my golly, this is wonderful stuff. And some get into it and say, well, you know, this should be preserved. This should be recognized and appreciated and preserved because someday somebody really is going to want to know this stuff. And so we have this index that is a lovely guide to what we've been doing. And nobody else has this. No other candidate. And in fact, the man from Stratford doesn't have the case. A lot's been written about him, but it is basically conjecture, speculation, or whatever. This is just a tip of the iceberg of some of the books that are out there. I'm sure that Nancy has all of these books on her shelf. And as she said to me the other, we were talking about how many books we have, books upon books. And she said, you get a couple of these books, you read a couple of books, and you find they have babies. All of a sudden, you've got more and more books on your shelves that deal with all of this fun thing. I am going to, well, I think it's fun. I'm going to talk about just 2 of these books. I'm going to talk about Shakespeare by Another Name, written by Mark Anderson, and Shakespeare's Guide to Italy. And in these 2 books, I'm going to illustrate how Oxford, our guy, we call him Oxford, fits the Shakespearean profile. Now, in those 18 characteristics, the one that I've highlighted here is enthusiast for Italy. Enthusiast for Italy. Everybody knows, nobody doubts that Shakespeare was keen on Italy. He set a lot of plays in Italy. He has sources that come from Italian sources. We know that he set Merchant of Venice in Venice and Taming of the Shrew in Padua, and he goes down to Messina in Sicily for Much Ado About Nothing. We know that's well understood. We know that. The man from Stratford never left England. Just that's for sure. So what about our guy? How would he have known about the Italy of Shakespeare? Well, Oxford traveled to Italy. Yes, he traveled there. He spoke fluent Italian as well as French and Latin and Greek. And we think some Spanish and Russian, of all things. When he returned from his trip to Italy, he dressed in the Italian style. He was so enthusiastic for Italy that he dressed in the Italian style. He brought back to Queen Elizabeth a gift of perfumed Italian gloves that were reportedly her favorite. Oxford was so completely submerged in the culture of Italy that he was known in the Elizabethan court as the Italianated Englishman. Now, I think we can check that box. Enthusiast for Italy? Most definitely so. Now, what do English professors have to say about this? Well, they will tell you that their guy learned about Italy from travelers in taverns. Yes, they will tell you that. And in addition to the tidbits that he gleaned from travelers in taverns, that he had this fabulous imagination, that he could just imagine wonderful things all around it. And those of us who aren't very smart, who might not think he wrote the plays, we just don't understand what a great imagination can do for a great writer. So, no one ever thought that they might go to Italy. So far as I know, no Shakespeare Orthodox scholar ever went to Italy to see if they could check things out and see if everything of Italy that shows up in the plays, the landmarks, the topography, the details of Italian culture, if they were really real or just were flights of fancy and imagination. An Oxfordian, one of our group, decided to do just that. His name was Richard Rowe, and he made many trips to Italy over a 20-year time. His wife, Jane, spoke fluent Italian, and they loved to go to Italy. And every time they planned a trip, they went to a place where Shakespeare set a play. He would study the Shakespeare play very carefully. He'd study everything he could find out about it. When he went to Verona for his trip to Verona, he'd read everything he could about Romeo and Juliet, and he would contact the museums around the area, the archivists, the historians, people who were knowledgeable about the past in Verona. Everything he could, he worked on every angle that he possibly could to learn what Shakespeare's Italy was all about. He set out this map, and I know it's too small to see, but if you want to get Shakespeare's Guide to Italy, it's available on Amazon, and this map is at the beginning of the book. This shows the places, of course, that Shakespeare set place. This is the Italy of Shakespeare. About that time that Richard Rowe was working on this fabulous book, another man named Mark Anderson was working on an updated biography of our guy, Oxford. And what he did, we knew Oxford had been to Italy, but what Mark did is he took all of the information that was available from not just Oxford's letters, but letters about him, everything that we could find, and he found quite a lot. He did fabulous tour de force of research on the life of Oxford. And he set out basically Oxford's itinerary. He figured out where Oxford went, what time frames he was there, how he traveled, the whole thing, and he set this out in a map in his book. Now, many people did not realize this. I know I didn't. I've heard other people say they did not realize that until they saw Mark Anderson's map, which at your left, next to Richard Rowe's map, where Shakespeare set plays. People, until they had these two maps side by side, it just didn't totally click until then that we had a match. Isn't that uncanny? Where Oxford traveled in Italy, Venice, Verona, Padua, Milan, down to Messina and Sicily. His itinerary essentially almost exactly matches where Shakespeare set plays. So I'm going to sum it up. Oxford is a writer who fits all 18 characteristics, which is no mean feat. The biography of Oxford, which I've just been barely scratching the surface by telling you about his trip to Italy and how it matches the settings that Shakespeare set plays. His biography matches in all kinds of ways that are just stunning. It's just stunning to us. It would be appalling to the Orthodox Stratfordians. And something else that I'm not going to expound on, but just to mention it because it's so crucially important. His education matches the knowledge found in Shakespeare's works. And just how, once again, how specifically, the specificity of where he was educated, of what he knew, what he did with his life is also a match. Remember all these things? Remember the law, all the music. He was known for his skill in music. He was known for his military. He had some short stints in the military. Of course, he's known for European geography. He's known for his language skills. He's got all the language skills that you needed for the linguistic skills to be Shakespeare, to read these books that were untranslated. And of course, as a favorite of Elizabeth off and on, he knew about court life in England and Italy and France. So I ask you, is it reasonable that reasonable people can have reasonable doubt about Shakespeare? And I close with an invitation. If you think so, please read the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. Now, the Declaration does not support any specific candidate. Many people have signed it who support other candidates. Most people do support Oxford and the story and the information that I have given you, in the case that I've given you, but you don't have to be interested in this and to sign this declaration if you wanted to do that, and you're certainly invited to. And with that, I'll take questions.
Would you all please unmute yourself so that you can applaud Bonner? She can hear it.
I can hear it. Thank you.